How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chafei, Daf 25 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, the reversion is complete. I managed to sneak ahead for maybe, if we're being nice, a day. If we're being realistic, a few hours. I managed to sneak ahead. But then came Daf 23, aka the brick wall, followed by Daf 24, which is all about Tumah and Tara, and it was gone. I am now looking for my next big break. In the meantime, we're gonna just keep going weiter. Today's daf is a gewaltige daf. It talks about the tzitz. I was talking to my father recently, and I think I mentioned to my father how, I think with pretty much all other mesechtas, whenever there's a sugya about the tzitz being meratzeh, it's like, oh wow, this is going to be a tricky sugya. And now it's like, wow, this is something familiar. Familiar is good. It's probably going to be slightly easier because it's familiar. And it's like unbelievable how a sugya that generally I think would be like, oh, okay, this is going to be tricky, is now like, okay, this is going to be easy. Unbelievable. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, just in case I don't think you're getting the wrong idea, but just in case you are getting the wrong idea, I mean, this is the best. This is the best. Tzitz Menachos is the absolute best. Also because, I don't know, I have this real feeling that this is so hard that afterwards everything's going to feel easy. But I guess that's yet to be seen. For some reason, things tend to not get easier. I don't know why. At least I find some way to make it harder. You know, if the Gemara is going faster, then I'll learn Tosfos. It is like there's always more to add. You know, all right. There's always more ways to make life more complicated. But when it comes to Limud Torah, complicated is a good thing, I think. I was just learning this morning in Tanya with my chavrusa that a person, it was a Gemara from Avodah Zarah that we learned, that Limud Torah is what? It's like Kishor La'ol, is like, and Kechomer L'maso, is like a cow to its yoke and a donkey, an ass to its burden. What's the difference between a donkey and an ass? Is an ass like female or it doesn't matter? It's funny when it uses that word. It's like, all right. Is it some kind of a technical term? Al Kopanim, where are we? So Limud Torah is good. It's good to work on Limud Torah like we are doing. So thanks everybody for being here. Let's learn Daf 25, Masechta Menachos. So as I said, we're talking about the tzitz. We're talking about the tzitz, the gold plate that the high priest would wear on his forehead. The first part of the daf, we will discuss what the tzitz is meratzeh for, right? The pasuk says, what does it say? That the tzitz will be meratzeh for the Oven HaKodashim. What are these Oven HaKodashim? So that would be the first section of today's daf, and the second section will be when the tzitz is meratzeh, in which scenarios, right? So the first part discussed what the tzitz is meratzeh for, and the second part discusses and in what scenario, shogeg, mezid, tzibur, yochid, etc. So friends, this is what we have ahead of us on Daf Chafei of Masechta Menachos. Let's have a great time, enjoy ourselves, and learn Daf Chafei of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Chafei all the way at the top, the very beginning of the Daf. Nitma, says the Mishnah, HaKometz. If the Kometz becomes Tameh, Ve'krivo, and it was offered nonetheless, Hatzitz meratzeh, the tzitz will be meratzeh. How do you define meratzeh, actually? And I feel like you've been learning kachim now for a few months, and meratzeh comes up, and I feel like I never know how to define it. What does it say? Oh, yeah, neither does the art scroll. How do you think the art scroll defines meratzeh? Affects acceptance. Now that is a technical definition. The tzitz affects, I can't even remember what it was. Affects acceptance? Yeah, okay. That's not something I'm going to use. So it's meratzeh, it kind of works. I don't know. It fixes stuff, makes it okay. Yeah, but clearly it's not easily definable. Okay, Nitma kometz v'kriva. 5. So nitma kometz. So the kometz became tummy v'kriva, but it was offered nonetheless. That's tzitz meratzeh. The tzitz makes it all good. I'm probably going to define it differently every single time. Okay, but the fact that there's the tzitz and there's a whole separate child which we're not going to talk about today is odu al mitzcha meratzeh, ein odu al mitzcha lo meratzeh. Right? There's a whole child. There's the kohen gadol. Is it only meratzeh if the kohen gadol is actually wearing it? That's a discussion which we must have learned. We've definitely learned together because I've definitely learned it before, and anything I've learned before, we've learned together, for the most part. So, anyways, where are we? Fine. So now Yotza ve'kriva. Now, if the mincha was Yotze outside of the Azore, and it was offered nonetheless, Eina tzitz meratzeh. In that scenario, the tzitz is not meratzeh, and it's possible you can't. That's not okay. So if the kometz becomes tameh and it's offered, I imagine saying b'di'evid, it's okay, right? I imagine we don't want people offering lechatchila tameh stuff. But if it was offered, right, it's like tameh is one of the examples. I believe on Daf Peidalet of Masechta Zvachim in the Mishnah there. Right, described, right, I'm looking at Daf Peidal Masechta Zvachim, Elu im alu lo yerdu, halon vayotze ve'atame. There you go. Right, these are the things, right, we had a list of things on Daf Peidal Masechta Zvachim in the Mishnah, of things that if they were put on the Mizbeach, lo yerdu, don't take them down, you can leave them there. I remember Daf Peidal, I think was a relatively easy daf. I think we learned it on a Friday. I remember these things. I remember which dafs were easy, because they're rare, and I take note. Especially because I think it was a Friday afternoon, and Friday afternoon I'm always struggling because as it is I'm struggling to keep up, and then Friday afternoons when I have to record too is a big struggle. So I remember that I think that was on a Friday afternoon. That was very welcome. Daf Peidal Masechta Zvachim. It's good to remember the easy dafs. Akoponim. So we see that a korban that is tameh should not be offered on the mizbeach, but if it is, we learned in Zvachim that it could stay on the Mizbeach. And also, we're saying, probably why is that? Because the tzitz is meratzeh. The tzitz is meratzeh. However, Yotze, I believe, was actually an example of something that would not stay on the Mizbeach. What did we say? I'm flipping back to that Mishnah for a second. So interestingly, Yotze is also an example of something that if it was put on the Mizbeach, it could stay there. So, but yet over here we're saying that the tzitz is not meratzeh for it. Okay. Anyways, where were we? We are saying that nonetheless, a kometz that becomes tameh, the tzitz will be meratzeh for that, and then therefore the fact that the tzitz is meratzeh, it's going to be a kosher korban. What does Rashi say? And the shirayim are able to be eaten. Interesting. Okay, but the shirayim are tahor. Okay, they were saying the kometz became tameh, but we're saying that the tzitz is meratzeh, the korban is kosher, and the shirayim can be eaten. Yotza, but if we're talking about yotze, that the kometz was taken out of the azara, v'krivo, and it was offered eina tzitz meratzeh, the tzitz will not be meratzeh, and I imagine therefore the opposite is true. The korban is puzzle, and the shirayim cannot be eaten. Shatzitz meratzeh ala tameh, ve'ein meratzeh ala yotze. Because the tzitz is meratzeh for tameh, for tumah, and it is not meratzeh for yotze. Givaldig. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Gemara, V'nosa aharin esavan hakochim. So this is a pasuk from Parshas, I believe Parshas Tetzaveh, that the Rabbeinu Shalom is instructing Moshe Rabbeinu of all of the big day kahuna that need to be made. And I'm going to read you the pasuk. Pasuk says, "V'haya meitzach aharon." In describing the tzitz, the Rabbanan Shalom says that the tzitz, the gold plate, will be on Aharon's forehead. V'nosa Aharon esavan hakodshim, and Aharon will bear the sins of the kodshim. Asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael, that the Yidden will be makdish. L'chol matnos kodshem. V'haya amitzcho tamid, it will always be on his forehead. Li'ratzon loim lifnei Hashem, for appeasement for the Yidden before the Rabbanan Shalom. So Tana Rabbanan V'nosa Aharon es oven HaKodshim. So the pasuk says that Aharon will bear the sins of the Kodshim, of the Korbanos. V'chieze oven hu noseh. What are these sins? What is this sin? Im teimar oven pigul. If you will suggest pigul. Now specifically, I believe the way to understand this is when it says pigul here, it's a reference to chutz limkomo. Harei kvar nemar lo yechoshev. Im tomer oven nosa. If it says nosa, this I believe is a reference to chutz lizmano. Harei kvar nemar lo yerotze. Ha'inu nosei elo avon tumashuchu michlala b'tzibur. Rather, what is the tzitz meratzeh for? Tuma. The tzitz is meratzeh for tumas akodshim. How come? Because tuma, we do see sort of a more lenient side when it comes to tuma, in that it is hutra b'tzibur. In that tuma is hutra b'tzibur. Oh, there's actually an interesting diuk. Okay, interesting diuk here that I saw actually a shtickle in Tosfos at the bottom of the page, but now I'm seeing it also in the Gemara. That the fact that I had this thing going on in my head earlier is Tumah Hutra B'tzibur because of the tzitz being meratzeh, right? Is it that the tzitz is meratzeh anyways and therefore Tumah Hutra B'tzibur? But apparently, no, it's the opposite. That when determining what is it exactly that the tzitz is meratzeh for, the answer is that tzitz is meratzeh for Tumah, since anyways we see that it's mutter b'tzibur, so kilu Tumah has a lenient side to it in that when it comes to the tzibur, there is no Tumah. Tumah is hutra b'tzibur. And since Tumah is hutra b'tzibur, when determining what is it that the tzitz will be meratzeh for, the answer is Tumah, because we see that it has that lenient angle in that it's mutter b'tzibur. And therefore, even b'yachid, the tzitz will be meratzeh. Very, very interesting. Okay, fine. Maskefla Reb Zera asks Akasha Ima Oven Yotze Shotim Chol Bebamit. Oh, okay. By the way, I think we've seen this Gemara before, I believe, in Psachim, Yoma, and Zvachim. Okay, yeah, sounds like it's the fourth time we're seeing this Gemara. Anyways, Reb Zera suggests that maybe the tzitz is meratzeh for the Avon of Yotze. That, right, like we suggested in our Mishnah. So our Mishnah, we said that, so I'm reading from our Mishnah, Yotze v'krivo ein meratzeh, shesitz meratzeh al atome ve'ein meratzeh al yotze. But Reb Zera is suggesting, right, so our Mishnah had said not so, but Reb Zera is suggesting, well, why not? Maybe the tzitz should be meratzeh for yotze, right? If the rationale for saying that the tzitz meratzeh is meratzeh for tumah because there's a lenient side to it, and that it's mutter b'tzibur, so Reb Zera suggests that based on that mahalach, the tzitz should also be meratzeh for yotze, since yotze is a non-issue when it comes to bamas. Backyard bamas, rooftop bamas are obviously outside of the azara. So yotze is permitted there. So therefore, maybe the tzitz should be meratzeh for yotze, since it has that lenient side and that it's not relevant to bamas. Omar le Abai responds, Omar Kra, the pasuk says, Liratzun lem lifnei Hashem, that the tzitz will be for appeasement for them before the Rabbeinu Shalom. Avon de lifnei Hashem in, avon de yotze lo. That a sin that is before the Rabbeinu Shalom in the Azara is what the tzitz is meratzeh for. Yotze, which by definition is outside of the Azara, so the tzitz is not meratzeh for yotze. Maskefla Reb Illa suggests a ma'ovin small shuter mechlala b'yom kippur. Reb Illa suggests, what about the sin of using one's left hand? Right? We learned about, was that in the, I don't think it was the first Mishnah of Masechta Menachos, but maybe it was the second Mishnah of Masechta Menachos on Daf, was it Vav? Yeah, Daf Vav, right? We talk about Komatz Bismol Pasul. For example, on Daf Vav Maral, the Mishnah had said Komatz Bismol Pasul, that you're not allowed to use your left hand. As we know, when you do the avodah, you're not allowed to use your left hand. So maybe if one did the avodah with his left hand, the tzitz would be meratzeh for that. Why? Where do we see some kind of a lenient angle to the left hand? The answer is on Yom Kippur, when the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies, he has in his right hand the I don't know if this is the right word, but like shovel kind of thing with the coals in it. And in his left hand, there is a spoon type of thing, I think, with incense in it. So in his left hand, he's holding the incense. So because there's a lenient angle to the left hand, which is that it's mutter on Yom Kippur, so maybe we should say that the tzitz is meratzeh for a kohen who uses his left hand. Amar le Abaye, Abaye responds, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Ovon, the pasuk says sin. Ovon choyabo d'chisiv lafuki Yom Kippurim de'achshero. Very interesting. That the pasuk says Ovon, a sin, right? Tuma is never going to be lichatchila, right? You're never going to want to be lichatchila, be doing things in a state of tuma. That's never going to be a lichatchila situation. It's always going to be a b'diavad situation. And we say, look, when it comes to tuma, right, it says, right, in Avon, a sin, Avon shahayabo udchisev, and I already, the Rabban Shalom is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, a sin that I already am doche, i.e. bitzibur, I say, okay, chaval, they're allowed to offer, right, the tzibur is allowed to offer korbanos bituma. So we already see that angle, bitzibur, so we say, what's the tzitz meratzeh for? For tuma, but on an individual level. Right, when it comes to an individual who's bringing, right, let's say a person, we're talking about the korban mincha, and the kometz becomes tameh, don't worry, the tzitz will be meratzeh. So in that case, the tzitz is meratzeh for tumah, which is inherently a b'diavad situation, which is not the case on Yom Kippur, right? That's not exactly what's going on Yom Kippur, right? It's not, when it comes to tumah, as I was saying, is never a lichatchila situation. It's always like a b'diavad situation. Right? Either say, okay, fine, tumah utra b'tzibur, fine, or the tzitz is meratzeh. The thing is, that's not what's going on Yom Kippur. It's not like the Rabban Shalom says to Haran a kohen, like, if you use your left hand on Yom Kippur, it's okay. That's not what's going on Yom Kippur. The instructions deliberately are, lichatchila, use your left hand on Yom Kippur. So it's not like we need the tzitz to be meratzeh for he used his left hand. He was supposed to use his left hand. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're supposed to, you're supposed to. When you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to. When you're supposed to, you're supposed to. And if we don't need the tzitz to be meratzeh for that. And therefore, to say that there is a lenient angle and that the tzitz is meratzeh, or to say that, it's okay to use your left hand on Yom Kippur, that's not what would be considered an avon that is being meratzeh for, or that was allowed. It's simply 100% acceptable and even encouraged on Yom Kippur for the kohen to use his left hand, and therefore it's outside of the realm of the avon that the tzitz would be meratzeh for. Rav Ashi Omar says, Rav Ashi avon hakodshim v'lo avon hamakdishin. Rav Ashi is medayik that it says that the tzitz is meratzeh for avon hakodshim, in avon of the korbanos, not on the ones who are makdish, not the ones who are doing the avoda of the korbanos and being makdish the kometz, for example. Not the ones who are doing the makdishim, but actually the ones that are kadosh themselves, the korbanos themselves, and therefore a korban that is tameh, the tzitz could be meratzeh for that. A kohen who does the avoda with his left hand, the tzitz is not meratzeh for that. Amarle Reb Sima Brei the Reb Idi the Reb Ashi, Ba'amila Rav Sima Brei the Rav Ashi the Rav Ashi, Ve'ema Oven Balmum. What about a Balmum? What if a Balmum was, what if an animal that was a Balmum was offered? Maybe the tzitz will be meratzeh for that. Shehutim Michlala Be'ofis, because after all, a mum has a lenient side to it, in that certain mums at least, are permitted by birds. We say tamus v'zachus bebehema ben tamus v'zachus beofis. That animals need to be completely healthy. All corbanos need to be healthy. They can't be treifed. But by animals, they can't be bal mums. Whereas birds can be bal mums, at least certain mums, right? If a bird is like missing like a leg or something, that's unacceptable. But the dokin shaba'ayin, those technicalities when it comes to like eyes and things, that does not apply to birds. So therefore, since mums have that lenient side to them, that they are permitted by certain things, certain kinds of mums are permitted by birds, so maybe the tzitz will be meratzeh for mums. So Amarle, so Rav Ashi responds, Alecha Amar Kra, he says, look, there are two psukim in the context of mums that tell us otherwise, that tell us that the tzitz would not be meratzeh for mums. And pasuk number 1 is lo yeratzeh, right? This pasuk says, I'm reading the pasuk, v'shor v'seh, a ox, a sheep, sarua, that one leg is bigger than the other, v'kalut, or that its hooves are not separate. Nidava ta'asa, also you can offer it to the bedek habayis. So the neder lo yeratzeh, lo yeratzeh. It will not be. So the pasuk says lo yeratzeh, the tzitz is not meratzeh. And also it says by mums. I'll read the next pasuk. The pasuk says kol asher bo mum, any animal that has a mum, lo sakriva, don't offer, ki lo liratzon li yelachim. It will not be an appeasement. The tzitz will not be meratzeh for it. So again, so says the Gemara, Amar kra lo yeratzeh and ki lo liratzon li yelachim. So the pasuk makes it clear that the tzitz will not be meratzeh for bali mumin. However, great question. And now we get up to the next section of today's daf, and what I think is kind of the more demanding. I wouldn't say demanding quite, but the more difficult. Also, I wouldn't more complex maybe. I'd say the part of the daf that's going to require us. You see how my left hand is kind of moving in circles. I think that kind of describes it. Anyways, when the tzitz is meratzeh. When the tzitz is meratzeh, and of course, when it isn't meratzeh. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, Dam shenitma, if blood became tameh. Okay, blood became tameh. Vizarko. And the kohen nonetheless did zrikas adam. So now there's interesting shaila. So when it says b'shogeg hurtza b'mitzah lohurtza, that by accident, hurtza, by purpose, not hurtza. Now it's interesting, shaila, right? So when it says, it's going to come up at the end of the Gemara, dam, blood. So there's two things. Shenitma, it became tameh, and vizarko, and the kohen did zrikas adam. The question is, when it says b'shogeg and b'mezid, are we talking about the blood became tameh b'shogeg or b'mezid, right? The tumor was b'shogeg or b'mezid, or is that the zrikas adam was b'shogeg or b'mezid? I think the assumption for now is that we're talking about the zrikas adam. Okay? So again, so Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis thought dam shenitma, blood that became tameh. Okay, so the blood is tameh. Vizarko, and the kohen did zrikas adam nonetheless. B'shoigeg, if the kohen did zrikas adam by accident, hurtza, beseder, it's kosher. B'mezid lo hurtza, but on purpose, not beseder. It doesn't work. When is this so b'yachid? This is by an individual. There is this distinction. Aval b'tzibur, but by the congregation, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza, whether it's b'shogeg or even b'mezid, it's hurtza. Okay, hurtza. Which is interesting because the implication here actually is that, and Tosfos I think points this out. Well, yeah, that hurtza implies that betzibur, it's that the tzitz is meratzeh rather than tumah hutra betzibur, which is very interesting. I think earlier it implied that the reason why betzibur tumah is okay is because tumah hutra betzibur, which seems to be separate to the tzitz being meratzeh. Yet over here it seems to be saying that that betzibur, it's bein mishogeg bein b'mezid because the tzitz is meratzeh. I wonder if there's a difference there between tumah hutra betzibur versus tumah dechuye betzibur. Very, very interesting. Okay, fine. Anyways, so the Brisa is saying that by an individual, if the dam was zrikad by accident, the tzitz will be meratzeh. On purpose, it won't. And on purpose, it won't. So that's by an individual. By the tzibur, whether it's on purpose, whether it's by accident, the tzitz is meratzeh. Uva ove kochavim, when it comes to avodah zarah, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, whether it was by accident, whether it was on purpose, right? So meaning, if you have an oved kochavim, a non-Jew who's offering a korban, because oved kochavim can also offer korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash, bring korbanos to the Beis Hamikdash. So in that case, if the dam becomes tameh, well, in that case, Bain b'shogeg, bain b'mezid, whether we're talking about by accident or on purpose, bain b'onus, bain b'rotzin, lo hurtza, then the tzitz is not meratzeh, because as Rashi points out, the pasuk says, "V'aya al mitzcho tamid ratzon lahem v'lo avdei kocham." The tzitz is meratzeh for korbanos of the yidden; it's not meratzeh for korbanos of the kocham. So what did we see from that brayso? We saw from that brayso that when it comes to an individual, the tzitz is not meratzeh if the zrikas adam was on purpose. Viraminu, however, we have a contradiction to the notion that the tzitz is not meratzeh by an individual b'mezid. We're going to see a brayso now that says that the tzitz is meratzeh for an individual even b'mezid. Al ma tzitz meratzeh. What is the tzitz meratzeh for? Al adam, on meat? No, dam is blood. Al adam, it's meratzeh for blood that became tameh. Ve'al abasar, on meat. Ve'al achelev, the fats that I imagine would be burned on the mizbeach. Shenitma, that became tameh. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, whether by accident or even on purpose. Bein b'onus, bein b'rotzin, against the will or with will. Bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibur. You hear that? Whether an individual, whether the congregation. So we see that this brayso is saying that there's no difference between the individual and the congregation. The tzitz will be meratzeh, whether b'shogeg or even b'mezid. So on the one hand, we had our first brayso that says that the tzitz, by an individual, the tzitz is meratzeh b'shogeg, but not b'mezid. Now we just had a brayso that says by an individual, the tzitz is meratzeh not only b'shogeg, but even b'mezid. Friends, what do you say? Rav Yosef says, lo kasha, nish geferlach, no problem. The answer is thus. The first brayso that says by Yachid it's not meratzeh b'mezid, that's the Rabbanon. The second brayso that says that it is meratzeh b'mezid, Reb Yossi. How do we know? This is the Sanya that we learn in a brayso, ein tormin min atome ala tahor. When it comes to trumah, if you have a whole field full of beautiful, beautiful crops, well then the trumah, the 1/50th that you give to the kohen, should be of those beautiful, beautiful crops. What you should not say is, oh right, I have some tameh stuff, I'll give that to the kohen and keep all the beautiful stuff for myself. Ein tormi min atomei ala tor. When you have pure crops, do not give as truma to the kohen tameh produce. V'imtarim b'shogeg, trumasu truma, v'mezid and trumasu truma. And if he did do that, if he gave to the kohen tameh crops, even though he had a whole field full of tahor crops, so it says the Tanakama, b'shogeg, if he did it by accident, trumasu truma. Okay, so the truma is truma. B'mezid, however, when done on purpose, ein trumasu truma, then the truma is invalid. Rabbi Yossi, Omer says, Rabbi Yossi, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid trumasu truma, whereas Rabbi Yossi says, whether the tameh produce was given as truma unintentionally, or even if it was done intentionally, it is nonetheless valid truma. So we see the Chachamim making a distinction between shogeg and mezid, and Rabbi Yossi not making that distinction, saying that either way it's truma. So we want to say that they will have the same opinions when it comes to the tzitz being meratzeh. The Chacham would make a distinction between shogeg and mezid, and Rabbi Yossi would say either way the tzitz is meratzeh. Aimer, the shamas le Rabbi Yossi, de lo kanis, comma. I will say, one second, not so fast. Sure, maybe when it comes to trumah, Rabbi Yossi says that even b'mezid, it's still valid trumah. And the Torah didn't fine the person, right? Because even according to the Chachamim, they also say that me'ikar adin, the truma is valid truma, even if it's tameh, even if tameh produce was given as truma, it's midorais, it's valid truma. But the Chachamim want to discourage such actions. So they fine the person by saying your truma didn't count. You have to take truma from the tahor stuff. So the Chacham say that b'mezid the truma is invalid because they're punishing him, they're fining him. However, Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says, okay, by truma we don't need to fine him. However, the meratzeh tzitz al achilos mishamslei. However, in that brisa that we quoted, that we're alleging is Rabbi Yossi, where it says that it's right. The brisa says, I'm reading from the brisa, top line of the Gemara. Amad tzitz meratzeh al adam ve'al basar ve'al achil. That the tzitz is meratzeh for basar, for achilas basar. Where do we have any indication that Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilas basar? Vatani, we learn in a brisa. Rabbi Eliezer omer tzitz meratzeh al achilos. Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz would be meratzeh for achila. Rabbi Yossi omer eina tzitz meratzeh al achilos. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says that tzitz is not meratzeh al achilos. So Rabbi Yossi, I don't understand how you could say that brisa is Rabbi Yossi when it says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilas basar. After all, we have a brisa where Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz is not meratzeh for achilos. So the Gemara suggests ipuch. Why don't we just switch around the shitas? Rabbi Eliezer omer eina tzitz meratzeh al achilos. It's Rabbi Eliezer who says that the tzitz is not meratzeh for achilos. Rabbi Yossi omer tzitz meratzeh al achilos. And it's Rabbi Yossi who's saying that the tzitz is meratzeh al achilos. And by just switching around the opinions, Rabbi Yossi is saying that the tzitz is meratzeh al achilos, and we can go back to saying that the brisa is Rabbi Yossi. Maskef Rav Sheshes mi motzis abchas. Rav Sheshes says 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. It's not as simple as just switching around shitas in a brisa. There's a whole world of Torah Shebal Peh that this needs to align with. We have to, before we can just switch around the brisa, we have to say, are there any other places where this is going to mess up? By switching around these shitas, how is this going to affect every other places where these shitas come up? And guess what, says Rav Sheshes? Ve'atanya. We have a brisa, right? Forget about that. As we learn in a brisa, Yachol Basar. So basically what this brisa is going to do, it's going to be a long brisa, and this long brisa is going to prove for us by the end that Rabbi Eliezer's shita is that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos. And therefore, to switch around the shitas and say that Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is not meratzeh on achilos would contradict this brisa. Ve'atanya yachol basar shenit malifnei zrikas domim. So if you have a korban, and it becomes tamei prior to zrikas adam, you chayavin olav mishum tuma. If one were to eat that korban, that the korban became tamei before zrikas adam, and then somebody, Rashi says the person was also tamei, ate that korban, would they be chayiv kares for eating kachim in a state of tumah? Whether the kachim's tummy, whether he's tummy, I think we're focusing on the fact that he's tummy. Tamulomar koltor. So in the context of somebody who's tummy eating kachim, the pasuk says koltor yochal basar, that any tahor person can eat korbanis, meaning if either you're a kohen or somebody who's allowed to eat korbanis and is tahor, they can eat korbanis. But if somebody were to eat korbanis asher la Hashem v'tum asu alav, and he's tamei v'nichrisa. Okay, so there's kind of a two-part thing over there, right? We're talking about eating korbanis in a state of tumah, and we're saying that anybody who's tahor can eat korbanis, and anybody who's tamei, if they eat korbanis, they're going to be chayiv kares. Hanitar litahorin chayavin olav mishum tuma. That when are you chayiv kares for eating korbanis in a state of tuma? If we're talking about a korban that would otherwise be permitted to tahor people, i.e. post zrikas adam. As we know, of course, the dam is matir the meat to be eaten, the zrikas adam. Now, our scenario, however, is pre-zrikas adam, when the meat is not yet permitted to be eaten. And if it is not yet permitted to be eaten, there was no shas heter lekohanim, ein chayav an olav mishum tumah, then you won't be chayav for eating it in a state of tumah. So now the Brisa says, "Oh, eno ella," or maybe what we're learning out from the psukim is ne'echol l'teorin chayav an olav mishum tumah, that any korban that is able to be eaten by tahor people, you'd be chayiv for tumah. V'she'enu nechol, if it can't be eaten the tahor and by tahor people, ein chayiv an olav mishum tumah, then you won't be chayiv for tumah. And therefore, otzi ani es halon ves hayotze, and that would mean that even lon and yotze, right? So they had a shas hakosher, right? So for example, if after zrikas adam and the korban cannot be eaten, but then it was left overnight, or it was taken out of the azara, so now you can't eat it anymore. If somebody eats it in a state of tumah, would they be chayiv kares even for that? She'ein nechol netarim, that netarim are not allowed to eat them, even though there was a shas heter lekohanim, they're not allowed to be eaten. Talmud loma asher la Hashem riba, that when it says anybody who eats from the zevach hashlom asher la Hashem, that is coming to include even yotze and lon. That if a tummy person eats kachim meat that was taken out of the azara or left past the time that it's supposed to be eaten, you would be chayav for eating that in a state of tumah. Okay, fine. Yochoshani marbes apigulin vesanusars. Is it possible that I will also say that you'll be chayav kares for eating pigul in a state of tumah? Or noser in a state of tumah? Nosar is hanulan. One second, noser, isn't noser the same thing as lun? We already said that you're chayiv for lun when it says asher la Hashem. So ella afa pikulin kinosars. No, what we're saying is maybe you'll be chayiv for eating pigul in a state of tumah. So you obviously will be chayiv kares for eating pigul, but we're saying maybe additionally there'll be a chiyuv kares for the fact that you're also tameh. What's an afkamina? B'shogeg, do you have to bring 2 korbanos, let's say? So Talmud Lomer mi zevach hashlamim mi says from the zevach hashlamim, not all zevach hashlamim, to exclude pigul. So we include noser and yotze in the chiyuv kares for somebody who eats it in a state of tumah, but we exclude pigul. Why include noser and yotze and exclude pigul? Shariba elu, shariba akos of miet. Well, the pasuk is including and excluding. Omrit marba anias elu, I will include in the chiyuv kares lon and yotze she'oisa lo shasa kosher, because at least at one point they were permitted. After the zrikas adam, these korbanos were permitted, and then they were taken outside of the azara, or then they were left without eating them. But they at one point were permitted. Therefore, there's a chiyuv kares for tumah. Elu, to the exclusion of pigul, shelo isalo and shasa kosher. Pigul never had a shasa kosher because already from like the shchita, let's say already there was machshavas chutz zman, chutz mkom was already possible from then. By the time of zrikas adam was already possible. If you're going to say basur shenitma lifnei zrikas damim, meat that came tameh before zrikas adam, ve'achalo la'achar zrikas adam damim, and it was eaten after zrikas adam, mipnei ma chayav olav mishum tumah. Why would you be chayav for tumah? Right? If the korban was already tameh before zrikas adam, so even after zrikas adam, there was never a shasa kosher. And you couldn't eat it after zrikas adam was tameh. The answer is mipnei Tzitz meratzeh, which is a very interesting answer, and that's the key right there. The answer is because the tzitz is meratzeh, which is kind of an interesting answer, because it's meratzeh, but you still can't eat it, right? It's the korban is tameh, so you can't eat it, it's tameh. But we do say that the tzitz is meratzeh, and therefore the korban is kosher, and therefore it's it's kosher, which therefore means that it's ki'ilu there was a shas akosher. even though you can't practically eat it because it's tummy, but we treat it as if, right, the tzitz is meratzeh, which means that the korban is completely kosher, which means it's as if it had a shas, as if it was mutter, like mutter la'achila, even though you can't practically eat it. It's kind of a funny thing, but I guess the point is that if we're saying that the tzitz is meratzeh for the korban, so it's meratzeh, the korban is kosher, although you still, practically speaking, are unable to eat it. Rashi says, you said that it's a good zrikas adam, because the tzitz is meratzeh, the zrikas adam is kosher. And therefore, because the zrikas adam was kosher and the tzitz is meratzeh, we would consider it to be nitar latahorim. Right? When the pasuk says, and we're saying that only basar that is mutter letahorim, right? Is that what we had said? What did we said? Right, we said nitar letahorin chayav and olav mishum tumah v'she'en nitar letahorin ein chayav and olav mishum tumah. So Rashi says because the tzitz is meratzeh and the zrikas adam is kosher, therefore we consider it to be nitar letahorim, even though the tzitz is, even though the meat is unable to be eaten. And therefore, this would still be considered that, right, like we said earlier, that the tzitz is meratzeh ala chilos, even though you can't eat it, but it's still meratzeh for the meat, even though you can't technically eat the meat. Now, nitma in yotze lo. Now the Gemara is medayik, or Rav Sheshis is medayik from the Brisa, that we're saying that the zrikas adam is effective for a korban that's tamei, right? We said the korban was tamei before zrikas adam. You now do zrikas adam. The zrikas adam is effective, and the korban is kosher. But that does not apply, right? Zrika in, where am I? Tuma, nitma in, yotze lo, but it does not apply to yotze. That zrikas adam would not be effective for yotze. Man shamas le, damar ein zrika mo'elis li yotze. Whose opinion is it that zrikas adam is ineffective for yotze? Rabbi Eliezer. That's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. There's a machlokes in the Mishnah in Masechta Me'ilah between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva about if you have a korban, if you have kachim, and before zrikas adam, it was taken out of the azor. So there's a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. If when you do zrikas adam, will that be effective so that there's no longer a din Me'ilah for the korban? Rabbi Akiva says yes, the zrikas adam is effective. Rabbi Eliezer says the zrikas adam is ineffective. So therefore, who's the opinion who says that zrikas adam is ineffective when it comes to yotze? The answer is Rabbi Eliezer. V'katoni dimeratzeh tzitz ala chilos. And in that, so that same brisa, which is saying that zrikas adam is not effective for yotze, it says it is effective for nitma, for tuma. So we're saying that the author of that brisa is Rabbi Eliezer, because we're saying that that zrikas adam is ineffective for yotze, and therefore, if the author of the brisa is Rabbi Eliezer, well, Rabbi Eliezer apparently is saying that the zrikas adam is effective when it comes to yotze, when it comes to tuma, i.e., that we're saying that the tzitz is meratzeh ala chilos. So therefore, to get back to our brisa earlier with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion would be that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos, and therefore Rabbi Yossi's opinion would be that the tzitz is not meratzeh for achilos. So again, so what was going on? So Rabbi Yosef wanted to say that Rabbi Yossi is the author of the brisa that says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos, but we proved from this other brisa that Rabbi Yossi says that the tzitz is not meratzeh for achilos, because we have this other brisa that Rabbi Eliezer says the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos. Rabbi Yossi says it's not meratzeh for achilos. We tried to switch it around, but we said no, that can't be. So if Chisda says, okay, no problem. Okay, fine. So Rabbi Yossi does not say that the tzitz is meratzeh al achilos, but what did we learn in the process? That Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos. So let's say that brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. Even if it's not Rabbi Yossi, it could be Rabbi Eliezer. Ema the shamas de Rabbi Eliezer de meratzeh tzitz al achilos. To which the Gemara says, one second. All we saw is that Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos, right? Even for the basar, as we said at the top of the brisa, that the tzitz would be meratzeh for the basar. So we saw that in the brisa that yes, the tzitz would be meratzeh for achilos. But the lo kanis mishamasle. But who says that the Rabbi Eliezer would say that we don't find them, right? Meaning, in the first brisa that we had at the bottom of Chafei, so the brisa had said that by an individual, the tzitz is not meratzeh when it's on purpose. Why? As a fine. The tzitz is technically meratzeh. We said it's meratzeh b'tzibur. It's meratzeh for an individual b'shogeg. Why is it not meratzeh b'mezid? It is meratzeh technically b'mezid, but the chacham find him and say that it's not meratzeh. So therefore, even though Rabbi Eliezer, sure, he says, right, but then we have this other brisa at the top of Chafei Amud Beis, where it's seemingly arguing on the first brisa, and would say that the tzitz would be meratzeh even b'mezid by an individual. Now we've seen that Rabbi Eliezer says that the tzitz is meratzeh for achilos, but who says that therefore he would say it's completely okay? Maybe he would still agree with the fine of the first brisa. Yes, we do know that Rabbi Eliezer does not find them. How do we know that? Well, just like we saw by Rabbi Yossi, we see with Rabbi Eliezer. What did we see by Rabbi Yossi that we now see with Rabbi Eliezer? The Sani Rabbi Eliezer, or my sister Rabbi Eliezer, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, chumasu chuma, like Rabbi Yossi had said earlier, that whether a person, I assume he was talking about, takes truma from tamei stuff instead of from tahor stuff, meaning he has a lot of tahor stuff, but he chooses that the truma is going to be from tamei. We say, but whether it was by accident, whether it was on purpose, the truma is truma, like Rabbi Yossi had said. But Ema de Shamaslei, Rabbi Eliezer be truma dekila. Okay, I'll say that Rabbi Eliezer says this by truma. Bekachim de chamire mishamaslei, but kachim, which is considered more chamer than truma, maybe because truma is misa b'dei shamayim, whereas kachim is karis, maybe. But anyways, how do we know that he would say the same thing by kachim? That there's no fine. Imkeno aman tramye. Well, if we have this brisa at the top of Chafei Amud Beis that seems to be saying that the tzitz is meratzeh for an individual, even b'mezid, and we're struggling to figure out who the author is. We said Rabbi Yossi, no, it's not Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Eliezer, no, we can't say it's Rabbi Eliezer either. So who is it? So now comes Ravina, and Ravina says, Ravina Omar Tum also. Ravina says, look, the two brises are talking about two different things. They're not arguing. We were assuming up until now that they're arguing. That the first brisa says that the tzitz is not meratzeh for an individual b'mezid. And the second brisa says it is meratzeh for an individual b'mezid. Says Ravina, the two brises are not arguing. They're talking about different things. Ravina Amar Tum also, when it comes to how the blood became tamei, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, hurtza. Zrikasu b'shogeg hurtza, b'mezid lo hurtza. Says Ravina, look, the important thing here is when this blood was tamei, if this tamei blood was zrikas adam by accident, the tzitz is meratzeh. Even if it initially became tamei on purpose. If it became tamei, as we see in the second brisa, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, that's talking about tumah. If the blood became tamei, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, either way, it could be okay. What's important is what the intention was at the time of the zrikas adam, which is the first brisa. If at the time of the zrikas adam, it was b'shogeg, the tzitz is meratzeh, regardless of how the dam became tamei. If at the time of zrikas adam was b'mezid, then the tzitz is not going to be meratzeh, like the first brisa says, even regardless of how the blood became tamei. Rav Shila Amar says Rav Shila, zrikaso, he says the opposite. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid hurtza, that the zrikas adam, regardless, even if it was b'mezid hurtza, tum also b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid hurtza. Rav Shila says the opposite, which is that what's important is how the blood became tamei. If the blood became tamei b'shogeg, so then it's okay. If the blood became tamei b'mezid, it's not okay. Which is what the first brisa is saying. The second brisa, which says bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid horta, that's talking about the zrikas adam. The zrikas adam, whether it was done intentionally or unintentionally, the tzitz will be meratzeh, and that's fine. What's important is how the blood initially became tamei. So long as it initially became tamei b'shogeg, well then the zrikas adam could be either b'shogeg or b'mezid. However, if the blood became tamei b'mezid, well then it's not going to be acceptable to be zrikas adam either way. According to Rav Shila Adikatani, that which is taught shenitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hachi kamer, when it says that it became tamei bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, it's saying nitma b'shogeg. It means that nitma b'shogeg, that the blood became tamei b'shogeg v'zarko bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, and then so long as the tuma was davka b'shogeg, well then the zrika can be either b'shogeg or b'mezid. Tashma kamanir tam shenitma v'zarko b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. That we have a brisa that seems to be saying that tamei blood, that the zrikas adam was b'shogeg, it's acceptable, but b'mezid it's unacceptable. How does that work according to Rav Shila, who says zrikas adam could even be b'mezid? Hachikam, this is what it's saying, dam shenitma, that blood that was tamei, v'zarko bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, the zrikas adam, regardless of if it was b'shogeg or mezid, if nitma b'shogeg hurtza, if it became tamei b'shogeg, then it works. B'mezid lo hurtza, b'mezid it doesn't work. Right? What's important is how the blood became tamei. That a person, the kohen who does zrikas adam, regardless of if it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, if the dam became tamei b'shogeg, then the zrikas dam will be hurtza, will be effective. If the dam became tamei b'mezid, the zrikas dam will be ineffective. Friends, that was daf chaf a, daf 25 of Masechta Menachos. On daf 25, we learned all about the tzitz. I think it was an interesting daf. The first part of the daf talked about what the tzitz is meratzeh for, and the answer was tumas hakodshin. And the second part of the daf, we learned about when the tzitz is meratzeh, b'shogeg, b'mezid, b'yochid, b'tzibor. We had a whole long sort of discussion where we arrived at the conclusion, at the machlokes between Ravina and Reb Shila, which is, Ravina says that when it comes to the tumah, whether the blood became tamei b'shogeg or b'mezid is not what's so important. What's important is that if the zrikas adam was b'shogeg, the tzitz is meratzeh. If the zrikas adam was b'mezid, the tzitz is not meratzeh. Whereas Reb Shila has the opposite opinion, that when it comes to the tumah, it dafka has to become tamei b'shogeg. So long as the blood became tamei b'shogeg, well then the zrika can either be b'shogeg or b'mezid, and it will be acceptable. But if the blood became tamei b'mezid, nothing that you can do, no matter what the intention is at the time of zrikas adam, it will be unable to fix it. That's the machlokes between Ravina and Reb Shila about when the tzitz is meratzeh. Friends, that was the Daf Chaf Hey of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.